If you're looking for the best summer beans to grow in hot climates, I'm here to tell you all about asparagus beans, also known as yard-long beans, long-podded cowpeas, Chinese long beans, snake bean, Bodhi, and Bora, among other names. But I generally refer to them as long beans because that's just a little bit shorter. These are the same species as southern peas, which are actually beans, but they come with their own subspecies classification. They're popular in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and southern China. While they're less common in the southeastern US, they're a great choice for the summer garden and even might be considered by southern Midwest gardeners. In my Austin, Texas garden, I find that they benefit from some late afternoon shade, but who wouldn't in this neck of the woods? If you're new to the channel, I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. Just like southern peas, there are many varieties to choose from, which makes this a lot of fun. This year I'm growing the Chinese red noodle, Taiwan black, and purple potted. Most of the varieties are pole or vining types, so you'll need to grow them up a trellis, but there are bush types, although they're less common. This year I'm growing one of those, and it's called Yanqing. And it's worth noting here that unlike pole type snap beans, these are not susceptible to damage by the Mexican bean beetle. When it comes to knowing when to plant these beans, you might not find a reference in your local planting guide, but follow the same recommendations for planting southern peas and you'll be in good shape. I want to give you some details and some insight into planting long beans from seed in your garden. I like to do this two different ways. Essentially, you can plant your bean seeds directly in the soil, and that's honestly the best way to go because they can be sensitive to some root disturbance, although I have primarily gone to seeding them in trays. And I want to show you. This is from the American Tray Company, so you can see they've got these openings on the side and big openings on the bottom. They're little 6-packs, super sturdy. I've used these time and time again. I also prefer them to the larger seed trays because it's easier for me to tote something around the garden, and if I'm doing different varieties, different types of plants, that just gives it more versatility in my use. But the thing that I want to highlight to you is if we're discussing root disturbance and transplant shock as a potential for planting beans from something like this, you look at this engineering here. This is going to provide natural air pruning to the roots. So the roots are going to be less likely to be circling inside this little cell here, and that results in a transplant that has more integrity in my experience. So I think what's key here is planting them when they're ready. I'm going to seed some in these trays today, and I would anticipate in the next 3 to 4 weeks setting them out in the garden. The longer I let them go in those seed trays, the more roots will get crowded and developed in there, and that might result in them being stressed upon transplanting, which I want to mitigate as much as I can. So the reason I want to plant them in these trays is because we are late July. We just had a lot of rain, and all those things combined, I know I've got a lot of organic matter in this raised bed behind me where I want to plant them. The soil dwelling insects that I rely on to break down that organic matter, which is then available to the plants that I want to grow and produce. So this is the soil food web in action. They also like these little bean seeds because just like my experience tells me, they're nice and sweet. They will quickly rasp on the base of these bean plants and I will never see them again. And this can happen overnight just as that bean seed starts to push up through the soil before it fully opens. The roly-polies, snails, earwigs, slugs, grasshoppers, they will come along and find that and they'll chew it. It'll be sometimes completely out of sight. I'll never see it and I'll think, you know, I didn't have germination. I get a leg up when I plant in the seed trays. I have to time it out right and get them in to reduce the amount of stress that they'll incur during transplanting. But I will tell you that's exactly how I started to grow these that are along the side of my house up here. I did them all in a seed tray and I planted them out even a little bit late. The roots were pretty well developed. But guess what? They took and they've been producing. I was really surprised recently with the harvest that I got because they started to look a little bit on the kind of fried side, getting a little brown. And granted, it was hot and dry. It was before this rainy spell, but they took off really quickly as soon as we got just a little bit of rain. And I had a really big harvest the other day. So you can do it from seed trays. no problem. You just want to look at those specifics, make sure you're aware of those limitations. And if you want to do both, that's a great way to do it too. I think succession planting is always a good idea because you plant some and then maybe a week, 2 weeks later, you plant some more. That way you can hit the sweet spot when it comes to the weather conditions, when they start to produce and are ready to harvest. Or if it could just be the germination and the pest pressure that's occurring. You know, in another week or so, it might be a lot drier out here and those pests might not be as much of a problem, or maybe they'll be more hungry. I really don't have a whole lot of seed stock today, and I'm afraid to directly seed into this raised bed because of the insects. Just to be on the safe side, I think I'm just going to go with the seed trays. I'm really motivated to save some seeds of these long beans this season, but growing so many varieties, there is a chance that they'll cross. Although long beans are self-pollinating, you can stagger them by distance, by time of planting, and that will ensure you get more of a pure seed. I'm going to plant these in one raised bed, and I've calculated I have 96 linear inches. That gives me about 16 bean plants after they've been pruned to their final plant spacing of 6 inches. I'm going to start them in these seed trays, so I won't need to thin them out, but I have 24 here, and that's about the amount of seeds that I counted here roughly. That's going to give me a little bit extra. Let's fill this up with a seed starting mix. I'm using the Light Warrior from Fox Farm, and it's pretty dry, honestly. You don't really want your seed starting mix to be this dry. I'm going to soak it, bottom soak it, and then I'll mist it from the top, and it should absorb water over the course of, roughly 2 or 3 hours. I do it in this little tray here, that way I don't have to worry about making a mess or wasting anything. Okay, and I'm gonna push it down in there. I don't really want to compress the material, but I do want it to get in the right space. Oftentimes I'll give them a little tap like that. That can help to settle things in there. But then I'll just go back, put some more on top, do it again. And at this point they should be pretty full and ready. If I keep my hand on the top and flip it over, you can see, even though it's got that big hole, it's holding things in there. That's what we want. Now I've got my little seed starting bamboo stick that I cut off one of my stakes, and I've marked it at 1 inch, which is the planting depth for a lot of larger seeds. And these bean seeds here, it just helps me to get a little bit of a start. I don't always have to do this, but that way my seed's going to stay in the center of the cell, which is what I want. Okay, and since I told you I did the math and I counted exactly 24, or we shall see, I'm only going to put 1 seed per cell. That way I won't have to do any thinning, and hopefully I'll be able to maximize my growing of these beans. Because if you have to thin them out, then ultimately you lose one, right? The recommended planting depth for these is somewhere between 1/2 to 1 inch. So I got them about like that. I don't worry about it too much as long as they're well covered. I just cover them with a bit more of that seeding mix, firming them in. I'm not going to push into each cell because I want there to be air in this mix, and those roots won't experience any kind of hindrance because of the compacted soil that you might get if you really pushed them in there. So that's perfect. I've got a seed marker here, which is really important because I'm starting a lot of seeds. You gotta stay organized. This is July 24th, 2024. The Chinese red noodle, a star is born. That's what I like to say. Now I'm gonna set these up on my seed starting pallet tray, give them a good soak, probably cover them with a humid dome just to keep the moisture in there for at least the first 2 or 3 days. But I'll be checking on them twice a day, and I think that they would germinate in these temperatures anywhere from 4 to 6 days, and they might not all germinate at the same time. The process for planting these directly in the garden bed would be the same. The average days to harvest when planted directly from seed for these is around 70 to 80 days. Once they start to flower, those pods will begin to grow rapidly, so you want to check them on a daily basis. I like to harvest them when they're roughly pencil sized, but I think the tipping point for me is when they get a little bit spongy in texture. If you give them a gentle squeeze and they feel like they've got some air in there, they may be of a little bit less desirable quality. But you need to try this for yourself because this is subjective in nature. They're not necessarily going to be bad at that point. They might just be slightly past their prime. These crisp and tender pods can be enjoyed fresh or cooked. I find that they have a pleasant and mild sweetness when snacking on them raw. And they're a nutrient-dense food source that's high in fiber, plant-available protein, and essential vitamins and minerals. Although their flavor is unique in what you might be used to with snap beans or green beans, they can be used in a similar way in your kitchen. But I've got to say, when I'm out in the garden looking for a snack, one of these fresh pods is the first thing that I'll go for. Otherwise, I like to enjoy them simply grilled or sauteed, but you could easily integrate them into a curry or other similar recipes. When you observe these plants and how they grow and develop, you'll notice that a little stem is going to shoot out from the vine, and that's where the flowers will start to set up. This is a key detail when it comes to harvesting, because that bud on the end of that little stem that's come off the vine will produce numerous flowers and beans over the course of a long season. So as you harvest, make sure you don't take off that bud. I do find that there's an ebb and flow to their production in my Central Texas garden. A lot of times they will produce really well and they'll get a little bit quiet here and there, especially when we're having a period of environmental stress where it's really hot and dry. The plants might get a little bit crispy, but I know that they will rebound, so I'll continue to give them some water and some care. And sometimes I've noticed that they will regenerate from low on the plant, and at that point I might choose to prune out some of the top growth if it's getting brown and crispy. And they will grow up to the first frost. And what I notice here in my fall garden, as the days get shorter and the sun gets lower on the horizon, they will slow up a bit. So production might not suit you at that point. You can choose to pull them and plant some other crops, but they will keep on going. Another great attribute of this crop is that they will attract beneficial insects and biodiversity in the garden. Many times I've observed hummingbirds and butterflies sipping nectar from their beautiful flowers. Another thing that they will attract is fire ants, because just like everything else that's able to get to these, they're attracted to the sweet nectar that's exuded from their buds. Generally, I don't find they're a detriment to these plants, but sometimes if you leave the beans on the plants for too long, you may find that those fire ants will start to eat them a little bit. So as we harvest our long beans, we do need to be on the lookout for these fire ants, because they're not one of the most friendly characters in the garden. One of the ways that I've found to get around this is that when I get one of those long beans, I'll tap it on my trellis so any ants will get flicked off, and you just got to be really thorough in looking at it before you put it in your harvest basket and get it in your kitchen. Wasps are another character that will be attracted to the long beans, and for those it's really just a waiting game. Sometimes you have to come back in a couple of minutes. They will have moved on after they've taken a drink of that sweet nectar. Well, I've grown a lot of long beans in my day, but it's not often that I have a side-by-side taste test comparison, and for the purpose of this video I thought it would be good to illustrate and contrast what the differences are in these varieties here. So first I want to try this Chinese red noodle, which I've really been loving. These are all fresh off the vine, so they're not cooked or anything. I mean, I love them, so I'm biased. That flavor really develops after you chew it up a little bit. I can see it's a little bit asparagus-like, little mushroom-like, got an earthy flavor, but sweetness definitely comes through, and very crispy. That's a good bean. Let's move on to the Taiwanese black. This one is definitely one of the longer ones, and it's interesting when we talk about the different varieties, like the Chinese red noodle. That bean itself is reddish in color. This Taiwan black, the pod is green, unlike the Chinese red noodle, and the seed is black, so that's where it gets its name. Now let's taste it. Definitely sweeter, a different flavor altogether. For me, when I taste these purple and red foods, I feel like I'm picking up on the anthocyanins, the different flavonoids, if that's what they are, that are in the foods themselves. So they have a bit more of a muted, earthy tone to them, but this one's brighter and sweeter. I also want to say that that Taiwanese black tends to be a little bit looser or puffier in nature, although I did not taste that whatsoever. You know, I think it just takes a little bit of a feel for them. But let's move on to the purple potted. I think this is one of the most beautiful ones, although it's late to produce. This is the second season I've grown it, and it's been the last one to flower and set pods, which I don't mind, because having a cascade and a variety gives you something to keep bringing into the kitchen. And yeah, this one tends to have a firmer texture in my experience. Much earthier, less sweet, nice and crisp. Maybe a bit more mushroom-like in flavor. It's quite unique, quite a contrast from the other beans. Lastly, I'm going to try the Yanqing, which is the bush type. Yeah, really good, but mild and definitely not the same as the Taiwanese black. So all those are both green beans on the exterior. They don't taste the same whatsoever. And so neither do the purple potted and the Chinese red noodle. Quite a contrast. And I think one of the cool things is that you can discover for yourself which one you like the best, which one grows better in your region, and from there you could potentially select the strongest plants and save some of those seeds. That's a really powerful thing to do. We need to do that in our gardening and our farming culture. We need to save our seeds, and we need to grow the ones that are best suited for our region. Keep it regional and seasonal. That's one of the things I like to say. All right, I just went and picked this one off the plants, and I wanted to give you an example of one that I thought was too puffy. This one is not really that puffy, but it is somewhat. This is the Taiwanese black. You can see that there's some air when I squeeze that. What's happening is this bean pod is maturing, and what we'll start to have is the beans themselves will begin to dry. The pod will dry, and that's how you get your dry beans, which you can then cook and eat. Also, you could save the seeds. So they're kind of changing their function from being more of a fruit to maturing seed. At this point, it could taste different. The texture will most likely be different, but let's give it a shot. Didn't even wash this one. Oh, that's still really good. I will say that the texture, although it was a bit more coarse, it wasn't unpleasant to me. So that just kind of shows you what direction the fruit is going in. When you get a sense of, what is prime time, has it grown to its maximum potential, you're just gonna have to get to know them for yourself. I think that's the best thing to do. This is hard. Okay. Be a good day to fly southwest. What? And it's worth noting here, these beans really like to grow, and they would. One detail that's really important to mention here is, as you observe, that's the way to go. You gotta get a private jet and roll out of here. Now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel, like this video, and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own food. Keep it organic.